On the 25th of January 2011, I went to a talk held by Ian R Crana called Surviving the Final Meltdown. I went there with another truth journalist called Gosling, and we both caught up with him after the talk. I wanted to ask him something that would at least summarise a small part of his presentation, so here is Ian R Crana on Iceland versus Ireland, Surviving the Final Meltdown.
Okay, I mean, to some extent, it is a very different situation. The only difference being is the magnitude of the debt. I mean, obviously, in Iceland, we have a population of about 300,000 people. And actually, Iceland went bankrupt with a debt that was probably not much more than about, maybe 15, 20 billion. And again, through the fractional reserve rate, they wouldn't have actually had to have come up with all of that in one hit. So the actual default was probably no more than about 4 billion. Now, what was very interesting was Russia stepped in to help Iceland. And the reason that Russia stepped in was because Putin said, look, we know what the IMF and the World Bank tried to do to Russia. In the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Empire. And in fact, I mean, that's the reason that Putin in Russia is regarded as a hero. Just like Castro is regarded as a hero in Cuba, because Castro kept Cuba out of the clutches of the US, and Putin kept Russia out of the clutches of the IMF. And so Putin sent a delegation of Russian economists to Iceland to help them sort of devise a strategy to avoid drawing down on the loans being offered by the IMF, because obviously the IMF terms were punitive. What we see in the media, and in fact you can Google this, what you see is a lot of articles around about late 2008 where the Western media was trying to demonise the Russian proposition to Iceland by saying, oh, this is terrible because Russia will get a foothold in the North Atlantic, they'll be putting their navy into the Icelandic bases. So we had all of this demonisation. So there was this political game going on. In reality, what occurred was that the Icelanders are not stupid. And they realised that they had to walk a very fine tightrope. So what they've done is they do acknowledge that they're working with the IMF, and they are happy to see the IMF press releases which talk about an IMF-led recovery. It's not strictly true, but neither is it strictly a lie. It's lingua franca. It's the language of diplomacy, where everybody just says, well, yeah, okay, we'll accept that that's the description. But in reality, what's happening is that the Icelanders are using the money offered by Russia and by Norway and some by Denmark. And it's small change, really, to these other countries to deal with the problem. And they're drawing down some of the money. And apparently, I understand that they've drawn about 500 million out of the 2.1 billion that the IMF offered, just to almost show willing. Now, the reality is that the Icelandic recovery is well in hand, because the Icelanders and the Icelandic government did not put any of their natural resources into hock or partial ownership of the IMF or anybody else. They retained possession. Now, what has happened in Ireland is very different, and basically the only option was the IMF and of course other European banks, which, as we saw during the course of the presentation, is everybody lending everybody else money on a fractional reserve basis. It's money that doesn't exist, but you can charge interest on it. And it's a very complex web that's been woven. But the IMF have basically said to Ireland, this is your only option, this is what you have to take, and what we want in return is control of your economy, which Iceland never ceded. Iceland has not ceded. Iceland has retained control of its budgetary process. So it's retained the right to set its own interest rates and manage its own economy accordingly. Ireland doesn't have that. Ireland is effectively ruled now by Olli Rehn, who's the EU Finance Commissioner. And Olli Rehn, of course, takes his marching orders from the powers behind the EU. So Iceland is today a sovereign nation. Ireland is not. And that's the fundamental difference.
Thank you very much.